Today we continue our focus on legacies and futures, and our particular theme is what do process-relational philosophies and theologies have to learn from and contribute to Black history. This is a celebration of Black History Month. It's also a challenge. We're seeking to understand Black history more deeply and to understand what others, Black and otherwise, have to learn from, grow into, face as a challenge from the richness of Black history and Black theologies. Our three presenters are just the best, and we're very lucky to have Monica Coleman, Theodore Walker, and Richard Rose. Monica is a very vibrant scholar. I've discovered that when students read her books, they are immediately lured into thinking new thoughts, into wondering how theology in any form can make life better. She's going to do some comparative reflection on process and Black theologies. What I'd like you to know in background is that Monica is Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware. She's also the John and Patricia Cochran Scholar for Inclusive Excellence and the Director of Graduate Studies in African Studies at the University of Delaware. In her teaching, speaking, workshop leadership, and writing, she explores faith. Sorry about my dog. I can't muzzle him, but I can go silent after I finish what I'm saying now. She focuses on faith, culture, religious pluralism, and social justice. Now you're going to notice as I introduce these three people that social justice are some of those shared interests. Her current focus is on understanding God in a world of change. The titles of her books reveal her wide range of interest in womanist theology, process theology, and depression and mental health. So here are some of the titles, and if you don't know them yet, I invite you to get them. They're well written, they're challenging, they're moving. Making a Way Out of No Way. Ain't I a Womanist Too? Creating Women's Theology, and the subtitle of that one is A Movement Engaging Process Thought, BIPOLAR God. Sorry, Process Thought. The next book is Bipolar God, which has had a great deal of influence on public discussions. Another one of her books is Not Alone, Reflections on Faith and Depression. Monica is also an elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, so she's been involved in church action and discourse as well as public and academic. Monica, we're really glad to have you here today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three of them, and then they will speak. I'll warn you, I'm in a Wi-Fi zone that freezes frequently, so if I freeze, just hang on because I'll come back. Theodore Walker will focus on ethical challenges in building a future. Dr. Walker is Professor of Ethics and Society at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. And I want you to be aware that Theo has been raising ethical issues within the larger theological, church, and academic community for years. And he has also been someone deeply steeped in the various branches of process thought. And so he brings a kind of unique integration to everything he does. I call him an integrative scholar whose work uncovers the process nature of the universe, the realities of racism, past and present, and the urgency of ethical analysis and action. I've recently taught one of Theo's former students, and Theo, you are on his lips every week because you had such a deep influence on his life, both as a scholar and even more as a human being dedicated to your students. Theo's areas of interest and expertise are very broad. These include theology and science, which includes astrotheology and cosmology, science and ethics, which includes bioethics, neoclassical natural scientific theology, and African American literature, theology, and ethics. These interests are represented in his teaching and publications such as The Big Bang and God, Mothership Connections, which, by the way, Theo, my students just loved. They read it with deep care because they wanted to hear every word of it. Empowering the People. And a representative article is this one, Interdisciplinary Ethics, from Astrotheology to Cosmo-Liberation Theology. So you get the picture of a broad-ranging scholar and a great human being. Richard Rose will focus on prophetic traditions in Black history, including Martin Luther King Jr. and the African presence in the Bible. These are two areas where he's been diving deeply in recent weeks and months, and I'm eager to hear what he's discovered. Dr. Rose is Professor of Religion and Philosophy at the University of Laverne. He's an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the Executive Director of the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies of Southern California. Richard earned his Master of Divinity degree from Howard University School of Divinity and the Doctor of Philosophy degree from the Claremont Graduate University, where, by the way, his dissertation was focused on Howard Thurman. His current research examines global issues related to interfaith dialogue and religious pluralism. He sees his life work as building the beloved community, which is the title of one of his courses, and in fact, of some courses he's going to be teaching through the Cobb Institute, which is now part of the Center for Process Studies. He's published a book entitled An Interreligious Approach to a Social Ethic for Christian Audiences, and another one, 7 Meditations on the Lord's Prayer. You can see from this that Richard is deeply engaged with the church as well as with his students at the University of Laverne. So we are in your hands and looking forward to it, Monica.
Good morning to some and good afternoon to others. It's afternoon where I am, and I'm going to set a timer so that I make sure we leave time for conversation. So give me 1 second to do that. I'm just going to do some reflections, and I want to begin by just saying the last time I was here is when Dr. Cobb had invited me to come and talk about using process metaphysics to talk about navigating change and grief. And it was a really great conversation with probably many of you who are here today too. So I guess I count myself among the Cobb friends. And of course, having been in Claremont for so many years, had many conversations over at Pilgrim Place and with Dr. Cobb, who is always just like, what are you working on now? Talk to us about what you're thinking about now. And having been at the service on Saturday, that's very much how he was, just such a great generosity and curiosity and never-ending growth. So I'm glad to be here with you all and having some of these conversations. I was also thinking about when I came to Claremont as a graduate student about 25 years ago. And I'm like, wow, has it been that long? And when I really felt like I was very interested in process theology, I got a lot of flack from Black liberation theologians who were like, why would you want to study this? Nobody's doing this. process theology can't address the issues that Black theology cares about. And I was like, well, first of all, I was like this baby wannabe scholar getting knocked out by these senior scholars. It was very intimidating, I'll have to say, at the time to hear that. But I kept thinking, I don't think that's true. And so I spent a lot of time, as have others, saying, no, that's not the case. I also want to acknowledge the Black folk who were in process theology and ethics before me, right? Theo Walker, who is here with us, Henry Young, who is happily retired and golfing on the coast of North Carolina, and Reginald Broadnax, who I think was one of your students, Theo. And we laugh because, two of us are Whiteheadian and two of us are Hartshornian, but we still love each other. And I had this suspicion within me. I didn't have a lot of sense of this because, as you know, it can be hard to learn process when you're not in Claremont, or at that time, maybe at Drew at the time. This was in the 90s. And so I had this suspicion that process theology could answer some of the big questions that I had about theology, about philosophy, about really Black religions. Not that I had questions about Black religions, but I felt like it would, within the context of Black religions, answer some questions that I felt were open and remaining there. And so I will talk about some of the ways in which I see maybe the coming together of process and Black theologies, or how they serve each other. And I've written about this in a couple places as well. So I'll say one of the first things, and that's what drew me to process, and it draws many people to process, is the way in which process addresses issues of theodicy, right? Issues of theodicy, of the problem of evil, of suffering, are always loom large in Black theological discussions, whether it's William R. Jones's conversation, right? Is God a white racist, right? Because he's saying, hey, if you say God's a liberator and we're not free, we have some problems here when you're working with classical notions of God. Anthony Penn's response to that was Black humanism. And my response to that is Black process theology, I guess, what you would say, right? Where Richard R. Jones said you either have to have a kind of soft humanism or a weak humanism, and either a strong humanism. I don't like those terms because it kind of creates a dualistic hierarchy. I mean, when is weak ever better? But what he meant about that was a humanism that was non-theistic, right? Or a humanism that was really process theology by his own description, a God that did not define control as authoritative. And I was like, yeah, that way, that's the way I think we should go. Now, Tony Penn and I will go back and forth. We've known each other a long time, and disagree with each other, but I think ultimately God is a faith claim. So I don't know that we're really disagreeing with each other either. I don't think you can talk people in or out of God per se. So I'm like, if you're a theist, this is the way to go. If you're not a theist, follow Tony Penn, right? And explore how he looks at Black humanism. But what we're both getting at is that classical notions of God, right, an authoritative hierarchical God, always leave open the question of why people are suffering and if God is allowing it, and all the reasons that we know arise and that people have tried to figure out. Is God trying to teach me something, right? Is there a pedagogical purpose to this? Is there a long-term will to this? And when you're living in, right, particularly for African Americans, a system of quite daily oppression of various levels in what we now call the United States, and for many other African diasporic people under a kind of global colonialism, these are very real daily questions in many ways. And I think classical theism just doesn't give you good answers. I think if you really think about it long enough, you end up at a tough spot. And as I think that's true on kind of a community level, and I think that's true on an individual level. So because I work in areas of mental health where people are dealing with suffering, and there's always that why question. When I teach process theology to people, a lot of people I work with are chaplains because they are working with people who have these big questions about why is there suffering? Why is there this injustice around, who's sick, who's not sick, and who's dying and who's not dying, and why we're experiencing this. And I felt like, and I still feel like, process theology addresses this. But if you're going to be a theist, and if you're going to believe that God is good, even though I'm not attached to God being good, but I like God being good. If you're going to be a theist, that process is going to give you some of the best answers to this. And it does so while maintaining our agency. And even though you may not hear a lot about language about agency, and I'm sure that Theo, because he's an ethicist, will talk about this more, agency is incredibly important in Black history because we always act as if we have agency. We rebel as if we have agency, right? We create culture and arts as if we have agency. We believe that our agency is real and is genuine. And so process really acknowledges that, the kind of process metaphysic. It also acknowledges and deals with change in ways much better than kind of very classical Black expressions about, God never changing, right? God is good all the time, all the time. God is good, this very kind of constant sense. Now, I am convinced of God's goodness, but I think we mean different things as process people who say that than when classical theists are saying that. And so it helps us to manage change. So if you ever stumble into YouTube, I ended up accidentally doing a web series during COVID with my colleague Tanana Reeve-Dew, who is an Afrofuturist writer or kind of science fiction Afro-horror writer, about Octavia Butler, and called it's called Octavia Tried to Tell Us, a Parable for Today's Pandemic. And I came to Octavia Butler independently as someone who loves Black science fiction, but also because she talks about change very poetically and very prophetically and very presciently. And there's so many alignments with understanding God as change and process theology. And you hear this coming through the experiences in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talent of a young Black girl in Southern California who is trying to survive in a world that looks a lot like today's society. So that's another text I would recommend. My time is getting short, so I want to talk about two other intersections for me between Black theologies and process theologies, and that's the issue of justice and liberation. And those are not terms that process theologians have used a lot, but I don't think it doesn't mean they don't care about them, of course, right? The terms are often things like the common good and thinking about the ways in which the initial aim is luring us. And of course, Black theologians care about freedom, care about liberation, care about justice. Womanist theologians have augmented that with saying quality of life matters too. We want to do more than survive, right? We would like to have a quality of life, which is hopefully even a little better than just having justice or equality. And so freedom is always important for Black theologians. And where does the process talk about that? Well, I don't know that process did 30 years ago, but I think the metaphysic has always had that as a possibility. For what some may name the common good is, well, of course, it's the best if there's justice. The common good is justice. The common good is liberation. If we look at adventures of ideas and talk about beauty and truth and adventure and zest and peace, well, add liberation, add justice, right? That these are the things that God cares about, you might say, the things that God is luring us to, what is calling us to, is hoping that we would use our agency to fight for, to maintain, to create, right? And to sustain. And so for me, there's very much that kind of synergy between the goals of liberation, which are really at the heart, I would say, of Black and womanist theologies and of process theology. The last thing I will talk about, I'll put all these in the comments so people don't have to worry about trying to catch up with terms. The last thing I'll talk about is religious pluralism. And my current work right now is on religious pluralism, and I've got a podcast and a website on that. I will also drop that into the comments if you want to check it out. I'm interested in the concept. I'm calling Black religious pluralism, but of course that didn't sound good for a podcast, so it's called Diverse Devotions, Black belief across boundaries. But I've become very interested in how the ways that Black people experience religious differences, and they didn't seem to map on to many of the major theories about religious pluralism. And it kept bugging me, and it's been bugging me for 20 years. No, more than 20, probably 25 as well. And I've ambled my way toward thinking about this. These were things I would talk about with Dr. Cobb and with David Griffin, because there was a kind of singularity of religious affiliation that didn't cohere with Black religious experience, or with many Black religious experiences. So I wanted to understand Black religious multiplicity in ways that a lot of theories of religious pluralism struggle with. What does it mean to be more than one religion at a time, or to be trans-religious? And even though it's not the same metaphysic, the ways in which Process understands there to be a metaphysic that may transcend what we might call religious differences, not ignoring the religious differences, but seeing that they live in a common worldview, can be very similar for what happens with African Americans in New Thought religions. And so that's part of what I study. And there are a good number of actually African Americans in New Thought religions. And of course, when they get in there, they also do a whole lot of work around justice and freedom, which is different than what you might see in parts of New Thought religions that are not kind of African American culturally based. They also bring other Black cultural elements, but they maintain that the language they use are universal spiritual laws, right, that are consistent across various religious traditions. And then they usually bring a worship style that would be kind of African diasporic to it. And people are like, what is that? You can't do that. And I'm like, yes, of course you can. There are plenty of theoreticians who understand what lay people might call universal spiritual laws, or we might call an operational metaphysic about how the world works. And then that could be true if you're Buddhist, that could be true if you're Christian, that could be true if you're Muslim. And we can worship together because we understand that we're all operating under these universal spiritual laws. So that's one of the things I'm working on, and you could find some conversations about that in the podcast as well. So for me, this is where I see and have experienced some connections between Process and Black theologies, just a couple of notes there. And lastly, where I hope the field is going, I'm not sure if I'm going this way, is that as we, particularly in womanist theologies, where I've been working more often lately, is we still have to understand the plurality around what we mean by woman and what we mean by Black. And so we've often treated those as static categories, and yet we know that they're not, that gender is complex and that Blackness is complex, and their contextual terms and their social constructions. And, because of the ways in which Process understands experiences and events, it really gives us a lot to work with in terms of how do we think about the construction of identity, not just how we name ourselves, but who we actually are and the kind of relationships we're composed of. So that's what I hope to see moving on perhaps into the future of the way womanist theology thinks about both race and gender in the way it does its work, in drawing from the strengths that Process offers there. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to having a good conversation later.
Wow, Monica, thank you so much. Theo.
All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. I'll begin with a thesis statement. Black theology and process theology should appreciate that Charles H. Long and John B. Cobb Jr. called for critical and constructive study of evolutionary biology and ethics. Some of us may recognize the name Charles H. Long, historian of religion, born 1926, died 2020. A former president of the American Academy of Religion and one of the founding members and president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion, Charles H. Long. Historian of religion, Charles H. Long, and process theologian, John B. Cobb Jr., encouraged critical and constructive study of evolutionary biology and ethics. And you see this in Cobb's writing. He wrote co-authored with Charles Birch, The Liberation of Life. And he edited and contributed to Back to Darwin, a richer account of evolution. Similarly, Charles H. Long regularly encouraged study of evolutionary biology, and specifically, he encouraged us to study the work of Ernest Everett Just. Some of us may remember the 1996 postage stamp honoring biologist Ernest Everett Just. Charles Long encouraged me to study the work of Ernest Everett Just. Encouraged is maybe putting it mildly, because I would see Charles Long regularly at meetings of the American Academy of Religion, and he would always ask me, "Have you studied Ernest Everett Just?" And the answer was usually, almost always, no. And the reason for that is, well, I'm a theologian. Ernest Everett Just is a biologist. Why in the world are you encouraging me to study Ernest Everett Just? Well, after maybe a decade of being harassed by Charles Long for failure to study Ernest Everett Just, I took a look at this book about Ernest Everett Just, Black Apollo of Science, The Life of Ernest Everett Just, by Kenneth R. Mann. And it turns out that John Cobb was correct in encouraging all of us to study evolutionary biology. And Charles H. Long was correct in encouraging also the study of biology, and encouraging me in particular to study the work of Ernest Everett Just, beginning with this biography by MIT historian of science, Kenneth R. Mann. Now, recall my mentioning Back to Darwin, a richer account of evolution, edited by John Cobb. The study of Manning's book reveals that a richer account of evolution had been developed during the 1930s by Ernest Everett Just. Now, if you don't recognize the name Ernest Everett Just, nevertheless, be certain that you have learned some biology from Ernest Everett Just, because he is the person who taught the world much of what we now know about what happens when sperm encounters egg cell and the fertilization process. Ernest Everett Just was, once upon a time, the world's leading authority on this subject, and therefore he is a global figure in the world of cell biology. Well, it turns out that Ernest Everett Just, cell biologist, famous for his book titled The Biology of the Cell Surface. In this book, Ernest Everett Just engages in deliberation about evolutionary biology and about the ethical significance of evolutionary biology. And he actually wrote a book on the subject titled The Origin of Man's Ethical Behavior. The Origin of Man's Ethical Behavior, co-authored with his spouse, Hedwig Schnetzler Just. And in studying evolutionary biology and connections to ethics, we appreciate those connections, and appreciating those connections is important for advancing process theology and its contributions to the scientific world. Similarly, Joseph L. Gray, who is the first African American to earn a PhD in evolutionary biology, wrote a book titled A Voice in the Wilderness, subtitled A Pioneering Biologist Explains How Evolution Can Help Us Solve Our Biggest Problems. And Joseph L. Graves, in A Voice in the Wilderness, prescribes attention to the work of Ernest Everett Just. And he prescribes that those of us who are interested in ethics should study, criticize, and constructively supplement theory of evolution and its connection to ethics, which is an area that some of us call evolutionary bioethics. Evolutionary bioethics. So, having been so encouraged by John Cobb and by Charles Long and by Joseph L. Graves, I encourage all of us to take up the study and appreciation of evolutionary biology and its connections to ethics and theology, and that this study should include attention to Ernest Everett Just. Now, in contemporary biology, studying artificial intelligence is advanced by recognizing that artificial intelligence is a subset of a much larger study of diverse intelligence. Okay? And the leading, or one of the leading figures in the study of diverse intelligence is Michael Levin, Levin, Michael Levin. And he has dozens of YouTube videos, plus many technical articles explaining advances in diverse intelligence and how artificial intelligence fits within the larger field of diverse intelligence, and connections to evolution and ethics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Theo. You've given us a lot to think about. And now we turn to Richard Rose.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share. And I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint for us. I'm not sure John Cobb believed I was a true process philosopher, theologian, and I don't know, he may be right. What I'm going to share with you all is some of what I'm doing in my local church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I serve as an associate at Bethel AME Church in Monrovia, California. And our church celebrated recently its Founders Day gospel concert. And you will see that in the statement made here on the screen, it was in November of 1787 that the colored people belonging to the Methodist Society in Philadelphia decided that they could not work well with their white counterparts, and so they established their own denomination. What I'm going to do is show some of what we're doing in my Sunday school Bible study, where we're looking at the African presence in the Bible, and we're reminded of Dr. Kane Hope Felder's work, the original African Heritage Study Bible, which we use as a primary text in that work. During this time, we also we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Ecumenical Center for Black Church Studies. This is a program that was initiated by Henry Mitchell in 1974 to allow persons in the Los Angeles area to attend University of Laverne, other seminaries, without having to go to those campuses, but classes were held in the inner city and churches and so forth, and the units used to acquire degrees. The Bible study that I'm currently doing is beginning to take form of preparation for a book. So we have been looking at the text through the eyes of Melchizedek, and you'll see why momentarily, but I'm looking to develop this text around the order of Melchizedek. And so we've got King David, King Jesus, the book of Hebrews, and then Ephesians, which the armor of God seems to tie into this personage in interesting ways. The Sunday school itself goes in a normal manner where we have song, prayer, devotions. Our responsive scripture comes often from the lectionary, or I'll choose a particular passage that we'll read. We do the Apostles' Creed, and then we do a little outline of the Bible itself and remind ourselves of the structure of the biblical text and how we have 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, with these various covenants in anticipation of the Messiah. The Messiah comes, we have one covenant, 27 books, the various divisions, and then we end by reminding the class that we have a prophetic figure, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is our prophetic voice for this age. And so that's in the background of our thinking as we go through this work. We started by reminding the class of the location of the Garden of Eden. Gihon is this river encircling the entire land of Cush. And so Ethiopia is the space that is located, that is recognized as where the original Garden of Eden is. And so before we even point this out, we asked the class, where do you think the garden is? And a few people have actually identified it on the map. So it's helpful to remind people of where the garden is. And then again, this figure, Melchizedek, who we encounter in the book of Genesis, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. Of course, he blessed Abraham, or Abram at the time. And it turns out that this particular priest is a Canaanite, or Jebusite. Jebusites were Canaanites. It's the land of the Palestinian Arabs. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Name in the first place means king of righteousness, and then also king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. It's interesting to see there are only two other figures in the Bible that are of the order of Melchizedek. First, there is David. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. The Lord has shown and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And then, of course, there is Jesus. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, you are my son. Today I've begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So it's interesting to see that this individual Melchizedek, if you look at extra biblical sources, you find that this person who was born prior to the flood was rescued and taken, see if I can get this here, was taken to the Garden of Eden during the flood, back to Ethiopia. And so that's why he didn't die. And he's like, living forever up in that space, I guess. So anyway, so we have these kings. We have King David, King Jesus, and then that queen, King Solomon. I figured King Solomon, King David passes his wisdom on to King Solomon, and that queen from the south, from Ethiopia, comes up and hooks up with Solomon. They have a son, Menelik. Menelik eventually has the line of Haile Selassie. So we've got another king here, and they trace their line back through Jesus and then back to Melchizedek in terms of the prophetic line. Then, of course, another king in the line, not by blood, but by being chosen, I guess, in some sense, as a king. This one love piece I have down here is the Rastafarian piece that goes back through to Melchizedek. And so we developed a rites of passage program, and we took the young people to see Bob Marley film, and we were able to show how this line goes back to Melchizedek as a part of biblical tradition that we're not always introduced to. So Martin Luther King Jr. does become a focal person within the order of Melchizedek that we have developed. And so we've developed actually a 6-year program, first 4 years of the junior order of Melchizedek. And so during that time, the students learn various African cultural traits along with biblical values, the values that come out of Ephesians, the order of God. And so after 4 years, they will be designated as junior members of the order of Melchizedek. And then the last thing I want to share is the way in which Dr. King is being recognized as truly a prophetic voice for our age. On Sunday, January 4th, 2025, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference held its Founders Day celebration in the city of Los Angeles. The service featured 7 sermons by 7 clergy members of the Christian tradition who honor the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the historic work of SCLC. And so we know the 7 words of Jesus traditionally preached on Good Friday, and then the 7 last words or 7 sayings of King, I think, are of interest. I'm going to go ahead and share them with you. Only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. We've got some difficult days ahead. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then oops. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. So the 6th word, I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. This program took place on the 4th of January, and then it was just a few days later that the fires broke out in LA. So that's a little of the tradition out of which the Black church has expressed itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. The 3 of you have offered so much richness and from different directions, which makes it all the more interesting.